So today is August 21st, 2016, and 147 years ago was 1869. August 21st, 1869. And I can remember it like it was yesterday. So, Johann, Anna Katharina Bruggerman, they had 7 children. The oldest was a daughter, Maria Katharina, and then they had 6 boys. And there's several theories about why they left. None 100%. But Johann Gripshover and Anna Katharina Bruggerman, Johann Bernard Gripshover, he was like the 4th Bernard, but they took off. They said, we're getting the fuck out of this place. We're getting the hell out of Ottmarsbachult. They lived in North Rhine-Westphalia in a small town called Ottmarsbachult. They went to church in St. Urban Catholic Church, and they lived on 23 Dorfbauer Lane, Dorfbauer Road. And so, essentially, on this day is when they got to America. So this is the Gripshover arrival date. The American Gripshovers. Gripshover is clearly a German word. It used to have an umlaut when you wrote Gripshover. It's Gripshover. The umlaut is 2 dots above the O. And so we say it in English, what it looks like in English, Gripshover. But I think when you pronounce it in German, it's like Gripshover or something like that, because if you actually converted the umlaut, U-M-L-A-U-T, when you converted the umlauted O, it's supposed to be O-E. And so actually it should have been spelled, if we anglicized it correctly, Gripshover. So, who were these people and why did they take off? So you had Johann Gripshover and you had Anna Katharina Bruggerman of Südkirchen. They lived in what is today North Rhine-Westphalia, but back then there was no such thing as Germany. It was Prussia. And even before Prussia, Prussia had only dominated one part, started by the Teutonic Knights and a guy named Prince Albert. But that's like in the 1400s. Eventually you got all these different kingdoms, Germanic kingdoms. Napoleon made fun of the Germans and said that they were always becoming, but they never were being. So they always were trying to be the Germans or the Germanic people, but they never actually got their own country, Germany, until 1871. But in 1869 is when the Gripshovers took off. And so there was a bunch of wars. Otto von Bismarck, he's supposed to be known as this master strategic person, and he started these wars, what people will say later on, because it looks so perfect, in order to unify all these Germanic-speaking countries. You had Hesse, you had Bavaria, you had 39 German, Austria too. And so actually that was the question was, do you want a lesser Germany where Prussia and all these other countries get together, or do you want the greater Germany where Austria is included in Germany too? And so in 1864 you had the Schleswig-Holstein War, which was Austria and Prussian who teamed together in order to fight the Danish people to get Schleswig and Holstein, which are states today in the Federal Republic of Germany. So in 1864 they fought a war, the Prussians did, and then Otto von Bismarck did, and then in 1866 they fought a war in the Austro-Prussian War. And again, Prussia was victorious. Prussia was victorious with the Schleswig-Holstein. Eventually they won one province, and then they bought the other one. So eventually Prussia was able to own both Schleswig and Holstein. In 1866 was the Austrian-Prussian War. And I don't know too much about the details of it, but I know that Prussia crushed Austria. But they was wanting to march into Vienna, but Otto von Bismarck didn't want to march into Vienna. In fact, he provoked a war with Napoleon III of France. And so the Austrian War was known as the 7 Weeks War, one of the fastest wars ever, right? 7 weeks, it's less than 2 months. And so that was 1864 Schleswig-Holstein War, 1866 is the Austrian-Prussian War, and then 1870 to 1871 was the Franco-Prussian War, when Prussia and France fought against each other. In between these so-called German wars of unification, 1869 is when Anna Katharina, and her 7 children, the Maria Katharina, Bernard, William, Theodore, Joseph, Ferdinand, and one that's not coming to the top of my head, but 6 boys, 1 daughter, and mother and father get on the boat of the Deutschland. They leave Ottmarsbechult. They sold their farm about a month and 5 months beforehand. They even sold the pews. They owned the pews to the church, or renting the pews to the church, but when they sold the land, they also sold the pews to the church. And they would pay taxes in eggs. They owed like 5 eggs a year, some shit. Anyways, there's the deed. I've actually found the deed to when they sold the farm. And then there was an article that was written about them in Germany. So during that time, it was like, they were, the townspeople were inspired. Good luck, go. And so I think the biggest reason, there's lots of push factors and pull factors. Why are they leaving Germany? Why are they coming to America? And I think the biggest reason would be the militarism and the conscription laws, universal conscription. So in order to be Prussian, which was all about military, Voltaire said that Prussia was, a lot of states have armies, but Prussia was an army who had a state. And so therefore the Prussians were very militaristic. In fact, the Prussians, I think, could be the precursors to the Nazis. And the Prussian state, it was all about their military, and it was about their strength and their domination and attacking people. And so because of their militarism, because of the universal conscription, every male body had to fight in the army, had to train and fight whenever the war was declared. They had to, and so because of the universal conscription laws, and because they had 6 boys, so their boys were going to be fed into the Prussian war machine. Now, I looked at the numbers when it came to the Franco-Prussian War. Napoleon III got his ass kicked, and it was because of the needle breech loading gun. The Prussians had better technology, and so they wound up killing like 200,000 French people, French soldiers, when the French killed about 30,000 Prussians. So the Prussians dominated. They totally kicked France's ass. But before the Franco-Prussian War, the Gripshovers got the hell out. If you look at the ages, you'll see that Bernard Gripshover, the oldest boy, was 18 years old in 1870. So he definitely would have been conscripted. He would have been drafted into the army. Now, if you looked at the ages of the other boys, they're 16, 14, 12, something like that. They weren't far behind. And, I don't know what the age exactly was when they conscripted. 16, usually any able male-bodied, if it's wartime, every able male body had to fight for the war. So I would think if, you look mature, if you look like you hit puberty and you were a man and you weren't a boy, that you would get drafted into the army. So that could have been 16. It could have been 14, too. So definitely Bernard was 18. So he was looking at being conscripted into the war and possibly getting his head blown off. So 1869, 1 month before August 21st, 1 month and 5 days or so, they sold their farm. Then they bought the ticket. They sold their farm for a bunch of thalers, which are silver coins. And they sold it for these silver coins. And I heard marks. They paid for the Deutschland in marks. So they're living in Ottmarsbechult, a bunch of Catholic farmers living in Ottmarsbechult, North Rhine-Westphalia. Today it's called North Rhine-Westphalia. That's the state. It's close to Munster. It's northwest part of Germany. In fact, it's only about an hour or 2 drive away from the Netherlands. So when I hear about the Dutch explorers, I'm like, oh my God, that could have been, my people. So what? So now we're crossing the Atlantic Ocean. So they went to Bremen. They bought their tickets in Bremen. They got on board the Deutschland, which was an iron passenger steamship. And it was one of the few iron passenger steamships back in the day. That was, not a lot of people were building big steamships and sailing the oceans. It wasn't a sailboat, it was a steamship, so it was an engine that ran on steam. And some people say that it took 3 months to get to the United States, but it actually, another report said it took 13 days. She found the date of when the Deutschland left Bremen, and then she found the date of when the Deutschland reached New York City. And it used to be Ellis Island, or it will become Ellis Island, where all the immigrants come to the United States, but back in 1869, it was the Castle Gardens. So 1869, this is before TV, before the automobile, before radio. This is before the Statue of Liberty was even erected. So this is early America, after the Civil War, 4 years after the Civil War, and 7 years or 8 years before the end of Reconstruction, which means America was actually in flux. It was in a very precarious situation. In fact, they fought the war, they said a lot of it had to do with slavery, but right before the Civil War was the 1855 Know-Nothing Party and the Know-Nothing riots. So there's a lot of hatred of immigrants and these damn Germans coming over to America, taking our jobs. And the Germans needed to go because they tried to fight a revolution in order to get their freedom, and then they came over here. Frederick Douglass says the only thing that a German needs to know in order to understand the black slave or the black man's situation in America is to know what it means to be a German. So I think that there was a lot of oppression in Germany. I think even if they might have been middle class compared to Germany's standards, back then, it was still poor. They were living, dirt farmers. They probably oversaturated the market, and so everybody had produce, and nobody was buying the produce, so they weren't able to make any money. And so a mixture of poverty, a mixture of, I'm not for sure how the economic system worked either, how their taxes and where all the money went. A lot of times you had these landlords. That's why they're called lords. So I think the militarism and the draft were big reasons. And I think poverty was a big reason. And then the promise of America. They were getting all this, this word from America of how great America was. So the Germans were like, holy shit, we got to get there. We got to get to this, United States and see what's up. And so they get to Castle Gardens. They had no visa. They didn't have permission to be here. They just signed up one day. And then once they got here, they checked them for lice, and they, got their names. And then they were free to go wherever they want to go. And they came to Kentucky. They came to northern Kentucky in Sanfordtown. And Kentucky was precarious when it came to the black question, the Negro question, too, because they were a slave-owning state, but they also fought for the Union. 100,000 Kentuckians fought for the Union, including 25,000 black folks, when 25,000 Kentuckians fought for the Confederacy. So most Kentuckians, including the government, fought for Abraham Lincoln. They fought for the Union. And Lincoln wasn't so much trying to free the slaves as he was just trying to win the war, and the war was for a Union. It was to keep the United States together. So the Confederates hated the United States, and they fought against the United States, so they were the first terrorists. They were treasonous terrorists who fought against this country. So that's the story of Johann Brueggemann, Anna Katharina, Maria Katharina, Bernard, William, Theodore, Henry. Old crazy Henry. You had old crazy Henry. Theodore winds up drowning. He makes it to America, and he was trying to cross the river, and he got caught in the waters, and he winds up either drowning or dying of pneumonia. And he leaves a bunch of kids behind, a Kunkel, Frances Kunkel. She had a bunch of kids. So one of them, these were the original Gripshovers. There were 7 children and 9 total. So 9 total Gripshovers were part of the Deutschland. That's what the boat was called, the Deutschland. Another interesting thing about the Deutschland, there was also anti-Catholic, so there could have been religious freedom. They could have left the German lands and come to America for religious freedom. So that could have been a push and pull factor, because Otto von Bismarck would issue his Kulturkampf, and they would pass the Falk laws, and it was essentially attacking the Catholic Church. Now, the Catholic Church was not a very good institution when it was the Holy Roman Empire. They're the one that started all the wars. They started all the wars. They started all the oppression. They did the Spanish Inquisition. If you weren't a Catholic, they'd kill you. And so he didn't like that the Catholics had so much power, that the Catholic bishops, they had a lot of land, they owned a lot of churches, they had a lot of say in the matters of church and state. And so he essentially started a political war against the Catholics, and he tried to get the Parliament to pass laws to curb their influence. And the Deutschland in 1875, so 6 years after the Gripshovers were on the Deutschland for 13 days, and there was one story about Joseph was about sick, and they're thinking about throwing him overboard, but then they put a mirror under his nose and saw that he was breathing, and supposedly that made everything, oh, he is alive. And he was like 3 or 4 years old, so I don't even know why they're acting like they couldn't see if he was breathing or not. But they didn't throw baby Joseph overboard, and Joseph actually wound up living a long life and having children. William, he didn't have any kids. Ferdinand and Bernard are my ancestors. So Bernard would have been the oldest boy, and then Ferdinand would have been the second youngest boy. And Ferdinand would have Camillus, who is my grandfather, and Bernard would have George Anthony, and George Anthony would have Teresa Gripshover, who would be my grandmother. So that's my connection to my motherland, to my, to Marsbachel, to Europe. And I think all this matters to me. It adds a piece to my being. But I want to finish the story. The Deutschland, the 6 years after the Gripshovers got to America in 1869, 1875, the Deutschland would sink. And it would sink, it would run into some ground, some dirt in the ocean. They were leaving Germany, but right off the coast of Harwich, England, there was the Kentish Knoll. There's just this big thing of dirt, you can't see it from the top of the ocean, but it's right there. And the Deutschland runs into it, and it pops the propeller off. The propeller falls off, and so now it's just sitting on top of this mountain of dirt without a propeller. And slowly but surely, the Deutschland would sink and killed about 100 Germans that night. That night, 100 Germans were killed, and it was kind of nuts because you had people that saw it, and then you had a bunch of pirates, a bunch of privateers, people on the coast of England saw the Deutschland was crumbling, so they got their boats and they went and got all the artifacts, but they didn't save any people. And it took like a long-ass time for any emergency ships to come out there to save them. And so it was essentially the Titanic, This could have happened to the Gripshovers. The Gripshovers could have been part of the Deutschland. They could have ran into this Kentish Knoll off the coast of Harwich, England, and they could have knocked the propeller off, and they could have drowned. There was 5 Franciscan nuns, and the Catholic Church would do a good job in using propaganda with this main point. But the 5 Franciscan nuns were leaving Germany because of the Falk Laws, because of the anti-German Kulturkampf that Otto von Bismarck, the founder of Germany, the Second Reich, the First Reich would have been the Holy Roman Empire, the Second Reich would have been the Otto von Bismarck's Germany, the Third Reich would be the Weimar Republic, and the Fourth Reich, Hitler tried to say the Weimar Republic was the betrayal, but it wasn't. It was actually the hope. And Hitler would have been the Fourth Reich, so he wasn't right in calling his regime the Third Reich. His was the Fourth. So Otto von Bismarck creates Germany in 1871, and Kentucky was a state in 1792. So Kentucky is an older state, nation state, than Germany. Germany didn't form until 80 years after Kentucky did. Now, there was the Holy Roman Empire, so it was a bunch of German-speaking lands again, but its heart was in Bohemia, and Bohemia today is the Czech Republic. So the Deutschland, the 5 Franciscan nuns, they drowned, and then they wrote this big poem, and supposedly right before they drowned, they was like, "Please, God, take me quick." And that's probably one of the worst ways to drown, to die, is to drown. Right? I mean, you will feel every agonizing second of that death. And those 5 Franciscan nuns eventually drowned to death. And it was only 100, so I mean, there's like 1,000 or so people that was on it. So most people were saved, but apparently 100 of them died. But they were leaving because of the Falk laws, and so they were saying that because of his anti-Catholicism, that's why they were taken off. So that could have been a reason for why the Gripshovers left too. So between the draft, between the poverty, between having religious freedom, my mother was a Catholic, or is a Catholic, and then her parents were Catholics too. They were traditional Catholics until Vatican II changed everything, and then some of them went along with Vatican II, the other ones didn't. But they're still Catholics today, so coming over here and being a Catholic was sort of a cuss word. I mean, JFK was the first Catholic, and that was like a huge deal. It was essentially a bunch of white Anglo-Protestants. White people, white Anglo-Protestants were the ones that were here originally, and then Catholic Germans, these German Catholics showed up. And when the German Catholics showed up, then that was raised, their fears. They're like, oh my God, them damn Catholics, they drank in church, right? I remember being 5 years old taking sips of wine. And then they had picnics, and they had Continental Sundays, so they were more rowdy because they had picnics. And because they were, in favor of alcohol. And then they spoke German, they spoke a different language, and they would stay to themselves. So I would say it's very similar to Mexicans. Mexicans who speak Spanish speak a different language, and they stick to themselves and sort of make their own enclave. And so the white Anglo-Protestants were really scared of these new immigrants, and then they started getting political power, especially since the Germans fought for the Union, like William Justice Goebel's father. And then William Justice Goebel would become the governor of Kentucky, but he would be assassinated after 3 days. And he's the only governor in the United States that had ever been assassinated. But he was a German Kentuckian. He was a New Dealer. He was in favor of the people. In fact, that was his last words, was always be fearless and loyal to the common people. And that he was a German Kentuckian, and he's one of the the baddest asses of Kentucky history, let alone him being a German American. So he wasn't a Confederate Democrat. He was a Democrat actually for the people. And so that's badass, because the Gripshovers in 1900, I saw a J. Gripshover who was part of a Goebelite Democratic circle. So the Gripshovers followed Goebel. Goebel was the Kenton County Kaiser. He came out of Kenton County. Sanford Town was in Kenton County. Kenton County was where the first fire department and the first elementary school came out of. And it came from Sanford Town, so it came from this German town that the Gripshovers were a part of. Now, I want to mention one quick thing about the precarious situation with the race. Some of my cousins today said that I didn't know my history and heritage because that's why they flew the Confederate flag. Really, they flew the Confederate flag because they're racist assholes. But there was John Hunt Morgan. I remember when I bought into that, Confederacy was about states' rights, independence, freedom. Who couldn't be in favor of independence and freedom. So I bought into it, and I read John Hunt Morgan. He was the thunderbolt of the Confederacy. There's a statue of John Hunt Morgan in Lexington today, and he gave the South hope. He had formed his own regiment before the war, and then he just basically was a guerrilla, just terrorizing the neighborhoods, cutting power lines, cutting telegraph lines, destroying railroads, making Morgan neckties, blowing people up, terrorizing the countrysides, looking for new recruits, forcing people to become Confederates by bayonet or by gun, and destroying any American flags and anything he could do. He didn't take the military straight on. He attacked the people. He attacked the countryside. So he was a straight-up terrorist. But eventually he got farther north than any other Confederate. I want to say, except for Lee and Gettysburg. But in Ohio, like, he went straight up to Indiana and Ohio. And then he went to prison and he escaped. So eventually he gets shot and he's killed. But he was an exciting figure for the Confederates who were getting their asses kicked the entire war. So I read this book and I was excited about it and identified with John Hunt Morgan. But John Hunt Morgan wasn't my history. John Hunt Morgan was very much against my history because he goes to Sanford Town and he's attacking the Germans at Sanford Town. And so the Germans are my people. Gripshovers come into Sanford Town. They were happy that the church there was speaking German. They had elementary school there. They were speaking German. So when they came here, they spoke Plattsdeutsch, which is called Lower German because it was part of the lower valleys of Germany, but they were speaking a different tongue, and in order to understand what was going on and to, feel like they could survive, they needed this German church and this German schools and this German town called Sanford Town. Sanford Town is going to eventually be wiped out by a flood in 1937, but in 1869 it was definitely a savior for my Gripshover ancestors. And John Hunt Morgan was attacking the Germans at Germantown. So the Confederates, we weren't Confederates. We come in here 1869, past the Civil War, so we weren't Union or Confederate. You couldn't claim to be one or the other. Being in northern Kentucky, I don't know, it would seem like you're close enough to the Mason-Dixon line, but there's a lot of racism today. But the end of Reconstruction kind of exacerbated that too. Slavery was gone, but then de facto slavery was still there. So I don't know specifically what our relationship was with black folks and how my German ancestors treated black folks when they first got here. But I do know the situation of the political situation of when they did. They definitely didn't fight for the Confederacy. The Confederates were attacking the Germans. And Frederick Douglass says to be a German, to understand black folks, all you need to do is to be a German. You had August Willich. I mean, the Germans have a long history of fighting the good fight, of being rabble-rousers, of stirring shit up. The Germans were the first ones to establish a socialist party. The Germans were the ones that, helped establish the first common school in Kenton County. The Germans did a whole bunch of stuff. So, I can go on about Germany. You had Francis Daniel Pastoris. He drew up the prohibition of slavery in 1688. He was a Germantown settler in, I want to say, somewhere in Pennsylvania. And then you had John Peter Zinger. He was a German New Yorker. He was arrested and charged with libel, but essentially that's when the freedom of the press became a cornerstone in America, because if you tell the truth, it's not libel. So Peter Zinger, this is a German American, John Peter Zinger. You had, Einstein, Karl Marx. So you had just a bunch of people that were Germans. So I'm getting off on a tangent here. Yeah. So what? So what's my point? I don't know. My point is the story of Johann and Anna Katharina is an important story to know. And if you're living in an area that you don't want to live in, get the fuck out. Get up and move. Sell your shit and get up and go. All right? Go to new, greater places. I'm happy that I'm an American. I'm happy that I'm here. But I'm not happy that my history was taken away from me. Who took my tongue? Who took my history? How did the man wipe out my history? How did he do it? How did he do it? And why did he do it? What was the point? Why couldn't I speak German? Why couldn't we have our own culture? The Germans, while the Prussians are, the Nazis are really shitty people, the Karl Marxes of the world, the Albert Einsteins of the world, you had architects, engineers, they were building the suspension bridge in Cincinnati, the Brooklyn Bridge. They were scientists, they were the fathers of culture and civilization and the scientific progress. Our entire educational system is German. Horace Mann goes to Germany and says, let's have the Prussian educational system here. Kindergarten literally means the garden of children. Hamburgers, hot dogs, gymnasiums. The Germans brought a lot of things over. So just in general, I like to know my German heritage and history, but it seems like in order to be white, it means to destroy who you are and destroy where you came from. And that's no good. Johann Willich, he was a military officer in the Prussian army, and he fought for the Union. So again, just Germans all over the place. Germans are helping America become American, and they're adding to the culture. They're adding to the American experience. The 7 Weeks' War, eventually Prussia smashes Austria and all of Austria's allies, Saxony, Hanover, Hesse, Bavaria, Baden, and Württemberg. And Württemberg, all these are German states. So he didn't want to take Austria, but he took all these other German-speaking states. They essentially were their own country. But because of Prussia, they all united under one state, which I have mixed feelings about, because Napoleon's saying the Germans are always becoming, but they never are being. But when the country was established as Germany, then we could say, okay, there's the country, there's the state. And if we didn't establish the state of Germany, I don't even know if we would even be talking about Germanic people. And the Germanic peoples have been around since the very beginning. Anglo-Saxon are Germanic tribes. The Franks turns into France. So France is everywhere. Germany is everywhere. In fact, English is a West Germanic language. So even the language that we speak is a kind of German.